From staring in disbelief as Holly Holm took out Rowdy, to pushing John Anik off his seat at Israel Adesanya KOing Alex Pereira, these are the UFC fights that shocked Joe Rogan. The veteran colorcaster couldn't believe that Ronda Rousey can be taken out that way, and it was pretty apparent from his expressions. Listening to Joe comment on the fights, you'd expect him to have some sort of quip for every situation, but that wasn't the case at UFC 193 in 2015. Back then, no one thought that Ronda could ever be beaten. She was too dominant, and always managed to finish her fights. Holly walked in there as a massive underdog, but as the fight went on, people started to realize that the hottie might just be able to fulfill that impossible task. She was able to temper Rowdy's aggression and didn't get sucked into a brawl that Ronda was so famous for. As the second round began, it became very clear that Ronda has never faced a striker like that, and before she could even gather herself, Holly ended Rousey's reign of terror with a beautiful head kick. Instead of screaming like Rogan usually does, he just stood there looking at the camera trying to process what just went down. It's never a good look to go silent like that when you're supposed to be announcing a match, but it truly was a jaw-dropping moment for the whole world, so Rogan can be let off the hook for that one. The women's GOAT had fallen, but another one rose in her place a few years later, and Joe had the best seats in the house to witness that one too. Amanda Nunes rose up to face the truly fearsome featherweight, Cris Cyborg at UFC 232. This was one of the best performances by the Lioness, as Cyborg had no answer. As soon as the match started, the two women engaged in a slugfest, and within a minute of round one, Amanda knocked Cris out to secure the 145 title, becoming the first female double champ in UFC's history. Rogan could barely contain his excitement as he stood up in anticipation of a huge knockout. And he wasn't disappointed. Nunes landed bomb after bomb and caused Cyborg to crash face first on the floor. Rogan was already off his seat, but then started yelling at the top of his voice with both his arms raised high. The Lioness had secured the GOAT status, one that even Ronda couldn't match. Sometimes I feel as if Joe is the best hype man any fighter in the UFC can ask for. He built up all the hype around Amanda, and he did it for Beneil Dariush as well. Sure, you guys know him now that he's knocking on Islam Makhachev's door, but a few years ago, no one really knew Benny. So Rogan took it upon himself to announce this lightweight warrior to the world. Dariush was engaged in an absolute battle with Drakkar Klose at UFC 248 in 2020, and both men were giving as good as they got. Benny was clearly hurt, but he somehow stayed on his feet and delivered some brutal punches to Klose's head. This won him the fight, and Joe went giddy with excitement. He leaned back in his chair as far as he could and kept yelling, "Oh my goodness!" But that wasn't even the funniest thing about the whole scene. Daniel Cormier actually collapsed in Rogan's lap because he couldn't believe what he saw. That KO was awesome. It was made even better with the reactions from the casting bench. DC also has some of the craziest reactions to knockouts, but it wasn't that long ago that Rogan was screaming his lungs out for Cormier. At UFC 226, the double champ and Hall of Famer was fighting against Stipe Miocic for the heavyweight title. Just before the first round ended, DC landed a nasty right hook on Miocic and followed him down for a few good ground and pound strikes to seal the deal. As soon as Cormier connected with that hook, Rogan knew what was going to happen. He had his hands on his head, leaned back on his chair, and stared in disbelief at the new heavyweight king. It feels as if Joe's expressions have just become wilder over the years. Or maybe the quality of the fights are just getting better, because he almost lost it at UFC 261. This was an event with 3 title fights, and every match on the main card ended by stoppage. Rose Namajunas was taking on Zhang Weili in hopes of winning back her title, and after an action-packed start to the fight, Thug Rose managed to secure the straw weight strap for herself. The head kick was picture perfect, and all Rogan could do was hold on to DC and Anik with his eyes wide and mouth open. He looked towards them, trying to confirm that what they saw actually happened. In the post-fight interview, Joe even got a little emotional when he was talking to Rose, and he wasn't afraid to admit it either. She had ended Weili's 21-fight winning streak and was able to overcome all of her demons. As I mentioned, that particular night was full of action, and Joe's reaction from them went on to become a meme, because he couldn't contain himself for the main event either. I can't say I blame him, though. 2 of the best welterweights on the roster were going head-to-head. For Jorge Masvidal, it was his second chance to dethrone Kamaru Usman, and the stakes simply couldn't be any higher. The match was going as most people expected. The Nigerian Nightmare was dominating Jorge, but the ending was something no one saw coming. Usman has always been a dominant champ, but people didn't see him as the guy who could knock people out. That night, Kamaru decided he wanted to show the world he could do whatever the hell he wanted to. He starched Masvidal with a hard left hand, and Game Bread was out even before he hit the canvas. Joe started screaming out of his mind, with his eyes wide open, staring at the camera, trying to grab onto Jon Anik's arm. During his long and illustrious career, Jorge had never been knocked out before, but Usman somehow forced his soul to leave his body with a single crack at his jaw. As much as Joe was in denial of what happened, it was nothing compared to what Leon Edwards did to the Nightmare a year later. Rocky finally got his rematch against the guy who had beaten him all those years ago and was staring down the barrel of a gun. Usman was completely outworking Edwards at UFC 278 in Salt Lake City, and there was nothing that Leon could do except keep getting bodied by the former champ. Through almost 5 whole rounds, Usman was ahead on the cards. Everyone had written the fight off as another unanimous decision win for the Nightmare, but Rocky then decided to pull a rabbit out of the hat. With less than a minute remaining to the end of the match, Edwards set up a beautiful head kick and landed it right on the sweet spot. Usman's eyes rolled back in his head as he collapsed to the floor, and the crowd went berserk. Joe was leading them as he kept screaming until he was out of breath. Once he regained some of his composure after what he'd seen, Rogan then said that Leon sent Usman to the Shadow Realm with that headshot. He also described how smartly Rocky hid that kick with a fake left punch. You've got to admit, Joe's reactions just make these knockouts seem more amazing than they already are, and I was saving the best one so far for last. Remember Izzy's revenge on the Poetan? Rogan just couldn't get enough of that, and he was so amped up that he almost knocked his colleagues off of their seats. Like, I understand him grabbing onto DC and Anik at times, but this moment was special. John was struggling to even stand up straight as Joe kept pushing him off, and if that wasn't enough, he took down the former double champ as well. I mean, DC was a heavyweight in the UFC, and seeing Rogan manhandle him like that drew a lot of attention from the fans, as they told the veteran caster to lay off the hormone therapy he was on. Joe also kept screaming that it was one of the greatest knockouts he'd ever seen in his life, and coming from a combat sports analyst like him, that means a lot. UFC 287 was the last chance for Izzy to reclaim his title, because he'd lost all 3 matches to Pereira prior to this. So in the second round, he decided to play possum for a bit, which encouraged Alex to drop his hands and open up on Adesanya. Seeing an opening, Izzy landed a perfect right hook and followed it quickly with an uppercut and another right hand. The KO, coupled with the last Stylebender's celebration, was enough for Rogan to lose his mind. So, from pushing Jon Anik off his seat at Israel Adesanya KOing Alex Pereira, to staring in disbelief as Holly Holm took out the Rowdy, these were the UFC fights that shocked Joe Rogan.